Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to today's colloquium on gender and justice, a global humanitarian and development perspective. I'd also like to welcome you to this first session. The focus is responding to sexual and gender-based violence. My name is Suzanne Toten, and I'm a member of the Theology and Religious Studies faculty, and also coordinator of the University Partnership of Catholic Relief Services. I'm going to give you a brief word on Catholic Relief and partnership, the institutional partnership between Catholic Relief Services and the university. Catholic Relief Services is the official overseeing humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. It alleviates suffering and provides assistance to about 100 million people in need in 100 countries without regard to race, religion, or nationality. This program includes agriculture, education, emergency, health, and peace building. In May 2005, Villanova entered into an institutional partnership with CRS. We committed ourselves to collaborate in education, research, service, and advocacy for the purpose of building solidarity with the world's poor and marginalized in their efforts to secure their life and dignity that belong to them. Today's two-part colloquium is just one example of the collaboration between CRS and the university. Before I turn this over to Dr. Somaly, I just want to do some quick acknowledgments. The first is to Dr. Carrie for her support over the years of the partnership. The partnership would not be what it is without the partner's support. Maureen McCullough, who will probably join us a little later, she is director of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic Regional Office. I'd like to thank the planning team for this event, Margaret Kowalski, who is the interim coordinator of the partnership, Kony, who is the Justice and Peace Partnership Liaison for the CRS Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region, and Lisa Sewell, who is co-director of the Center for Gender and Women's Studies here at Villanova. And I also want to thank Lisa London, who is the new administrative assistant for the partnership. The following co-sponsors were very gracious in promoting today the Gender and Women's Studies program, the Center for Peace and Justice Education, Global Interdisciplinary Studies, Cultural Studies, Ethics program, Honors program, and the following academic departments: Political Science, Sociology, Theology, and Religious Studies. I just want to make an announcement for the students who are here, whose teachers asked them to come to this event and encourage them to come to this event. There's a wild card scanner on your way out. I'll remind you of that at the very end if you didn't have a chance. And I want to turn this over now to Professor Somaly.
Hi, we're on a pretty tight schedule, so I just want to give you a really brief sense of how this part of the colloquium is going to work. We're going to hear from our speaker, have two respondents, and then we're going to sort of break into discussion groups and chat for a while, and then come back together with some responses to our discussion. Our speaker today is Francisca Viguad-Walsh. She's a Catholic Relief Services Technical Advisor for Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Emergency Operations. She has a decade of experience in the protection sector with a specialization in sexual and gender-based violence. Viguad-Walsh launched her career with the International Rescue Committee, providing services to refugees and displaced communities, and continued onto Church World Service and UNHCR, where she conducted refugee status determinations and resettlement eligibility verification and processing for refugees through East, Central, and West Africa. In 2006, she joined CRS, where she has held several positions, including Emergency Programs Manager in Abidjan, Chad, and most recently SGBV Program Manager for CRS programs worldwide. And we have two respondents. The first is Dr. Tim Horner. He's a member of the faculty for the Center for Liberal Education and the Center for Peace and Justice Education in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. His doctorate is in early church history and early Jewish-Christian relations. After the events of 9/11, Professor Horner's research interests turned to the issue of genocide and the puzzle of human behavior and organized mass violence. He has been to Rwanda several times for his research on the 1994 genocide, and with Villanova students for a summer course he developed. Professor Michelle Dempsey is our other respondent. She serves on the faculty of Villanova School of Law. She teaches and writes in the areas of criminal law, feminist legal history, and jurisprudence. Her book, Prosecuting Domestic Violence, A Philosophical Analysis, was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. In addition to her JD, she holds an LLM from the London School of Economics and a DPhil from Oxford University. But we'll start with Francisca.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here. Excuse me while I just set this up. Okay. As clear by now, we're going to speak a bit about sexual and gender-based violence today. I think that I'll first start off just with defining it a bit, and then focusing in on 2 case studies that CRS has worked with. I don't want to bog you down with definitions, but I did think it was worth it to just go over a bit what SGBV is. I've learned that one can assume all the ins and outs, that everyone understands what SGBV is, and I wanted to communicate this to you through the voice of some of the people that I have worked with, as well as some official statistics and figures. So, let's see, is this not working? Uh-oh. Already a techie problem. Let's see. Okay, great. So one Darfuri girl in a refugee camp in eastern Chad explained to me, "I ran away because I did not want to marry that old man I had never met. I told my father that I wanted to continue going to the UNICEF school. I am only 13, but he chased me down and beat me so hard that I can't even feel my legs now." A circumciser in Kenya: "When you cut a girl, you know she will remain pure until she gets married, and that after marriage, she will be faithful. But when you leave a girl uncut, she sleeps with any man in the community." A former Burmese child soldier explained, "They filled the forms and asked my age. When I said 16, I was slapped, and he said, 'You are 18, answer 18. He asked me again, and I said, 'But that's my true age.' The sergeant asked, 'Then why did you enlist in the army?' I said, 'Against my will, I was captured.' He said, 'Okay, keep your mouth shut then,' and he filled in the form. I just wanted to go back home, and I told them, but they refused." 1 in 3 women in rural Uganda is subject to verbal or physical threats from their partners. 50% of those women who have been threatened subsequently receive injuries. Beating a female partner was viewed as justifiable in certain circumstances by 70% of the male survey respondents and 90% of female respondents, interestingly. The study also revealed that domestic violence may be an important factor in women's susceptibility, to acquiring HIV, and that comes from a WHO study. And STGs, a term that elementary school children came up with in West Africa. It's believed to have started in Ghana. Sexually transmitted grades. And finally, unfortunately, sexual and gender-based violence that is sometimes perpetuated through humanitarian aid. We are told your name is not on the list, and your name is not on the list the refugee camp leader gave us. In this community, no one can access soya without having sex first. They say, a kilo for sex. If you see a young girl walking away with plastic sheeting, which is used for tents, you know how she got it. And then finally, due to systematic and exceptionally violent gang rape, doctors in DRC now classify vaginal destruction as a crime of combat. Thousands of Congolese girls and women suffer from vaginal fistula, tissue tears in the vagina, bladder, and rectum after surviving brutal rapes in which guns and branches are used to violate them. A survey of rape survivors in South Kivu revealed that 91% suffered from one or several rape-related illnesses. So as you can see, sexual and gender-based violence is not limited to domestic violence exclusively, and it affects everybody. From the child soldier, the child that is taken out of school because he is taught to be a warrior, to the girl that is circumcised, otherwise it is believed that she will not be a good wife, to those in the context of war, in the context of development. SGBV really does not have any boundaries, limitations. It is not limited to any particular race, country, continent. It's a worldwide problem that manifests itself in several ways. The actual short, condensed definition, just to finalize with this introduction, is violence that is directed against a person on the basis of their gender or sex. It includes acts that inflict physical, mental, or sexual harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, and other deprivations of liberty. The term SGBV is used to distinguish common violence from violence that targets individuals or groups of individuals on the basis of their gender or roles, gender roles ascribed to them in their societies. So I am now going to introduce 2 case studies by showing you one 2-minute clip and another 3-minute clip, if you will bear with me. Let's see if this, I don't know why my computer is slowing down now. Whoops. Okay, we'll start off with this one then. This is a CRS video showing partners that we work with in Congo.
Rape has been used as a weapon of war, so we cannot even say anymore that it was a war between armies. It was a war against civil society, against the civilian population, and more particularly against women and children. The greatest suffering recently endured by the Congolese people has regarded the issue of sexual violence. When a woman is raped, the whole community is deprived of its dignity. By raping a woman in Africa, you are raping what gives value to the community. The war in Congo is an economic war, with rape on a grand scale. And it's not just a Congolese issue. In Congo, the issue of rape is linked to other variables regarding the presence of armed groups and the issue of resources.
La maison au coin, c'est une maison où sont accueillis.
The house on the corner is where young girls who've come back from the forest are received. They have been subjected to sexual violence, kidnapped, and taken to the forest to be used as sex slaves. Most of these young girls are under 18.
On les accueille ici pour
We look after them here for the time it takes for them to regain their strength, to be de-traumatized, to get in touch with their families, and to gain some understanding of the extent to which each of them has been traumatized. And as soon as possible, they're reintegrated into their families. However, in some cases, a young girl with a child is not accepted, because that is also a tragic element. Most of the girls have been made pregnant by Rwandan Hutus. Besides, with all the violence they've endured, followed by the birth of the child, one feels that the child is not greatly loved. And within the family, the child may be stigmatized. But help is given with education and basic needs.
This doesn't seem to be working, so I won't show you a clip from Haiti. I apologize. In showing you the clip about Haiti and speaking about humanitarian aid, which is unfortunately quite a different beast from development work, one of the reasons why I'm speaking about sexual and gender-based violence is that it escalates greatly in the context of humanitarian aid, or rather humanitarian settings. So this here, this here is a picture from Haiti just after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, and this from Eastern Congo. Extremely different context. One, a natural disaster, and in the other case, man-made disaster, conflict, large-scale war. Yet, they are facing, or women and girls particularly, are facing exactly the same issues. Looking at both and looking at the points of intersection, we have two countries that already experience sexual and gender-based violence on a general basis, but they're two weak states that once you add into the mix gender inequities plus a crisis, you have escalation. And this is because of pre-existing notions of gender roles, such as in the case of the child soldier from Burma that I spoke about. Boys are taught to be strong, that they need to fight, that they can't cry. Fighting is more important than education. There was already a pre-existing substandard system for protecting women, girls, and boys. In the case of Haiti, rape was only made a criminal offense, in the year 2005. That's just 7 years ago. And then in the wake of disaster, a complete vacuum of law and order. Family separation and the breakdown of community networks highlights life in the wake of a disaster. I recently came back from several weeks in Niger and Burkina Faso looking at the new Mali crisis, the refugees from Mali that are coming into Niger and Burkina. And unfortunately, the first thing that we're seeing is family separation, because men and boys are staying at the border or just inside the Mali side of the border with their livestock. Livestock is so incredibly important, and it is the economy of a family. It signifies the economy, and they don't feel that they can take the livestock with them to the refugee camps. So families are now separating, and women and girls are going alone. With the breakdown of these community networks, your natural traditional mechanisms for protecting women and girls from rape or other types of exploitation and abuse do no longer exist. Acute trauma from just war or the earthquake, whichever the situation, the disaster is. Lack of shelter and privacy, a drastic change in one's lifestyle, and loss of livelihoods. All these things are just a terrible melting pot of conditions to increase the vulnerability of people to overcome and to prevent acts of sexual and gender-based violence. So they create the conditions for increased vulnerability to abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. There's an increased burden on women to feed and care for their families, and the increase in women-headed households, as in the case of Niger that I just highlighted, typically also leads to a surge in intimate partner domestic violence. In those households where men are there, but women now are contributing to bringing home food, to being in charge of contributing to the economy of the household, men who traditionally feel that they are the sole breadwinners start to feel that they are divested of their power, which leads to intimate partner violence in the household. And the increased stress to support oneself, children, the elderly, injured, and disabled leaves women and girls more vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. So, in emergency operations, responding to SGBV, the first thing that one looks at, be it CRS or any other agency working in this, is what is a survivor's needs? They are quite overwhelming in some cases, ranging from legal and advice and counsel, immediate HIV and STI testing and care, immediate primary health care, in some cases, in extreme cases such as some areas of Colombia and Congo, for example, fistula surgery, fistula repair, intense counseling, community and family mediation, especially for those families that reject rape survivors, food and other materials that are needed, and support systems, economic programs to help women and girls reintegrate into their communities, or child soldiers reintegrate into their communities, particularly those that no longer have the chance of returning to their household because they're so stigmatized. And what this looks like, I won't go into detail, but we do have an international framework that guides our SGBV prevention and response operations. We have the community or the beneficiaries that we serve at the center. We must ensure that they receive in all 4 sectors, 4 pillars of assistance: health services, legal and justice services, safety and security services, and psychosocial assistance. This is done in coordination among different actors. That is to say, no aid agency has the core competencies or skill set in each one of these 4 pillars. So it's very important that CRS and any organization continuously coordinate with other organizations with a set of guiding principles regarding confidentiality and safety, security, ethics, that guide how we operate and how we interact with rape survivors. And obviously there is a whole another level of authorities that we need to deal with. Unfortunately, in some cases, the very authorities that we must coordinate with are those that are perpetrating or organizing some of the sexual violence. To give you 2 studies or 2 examples of work that we do, in DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo, we've worked a lot with sensitization. That is to say, working actually with illegally armed militia groups, training them in human rights, training them in gender issues, training them on their role as a military, albeit illegal, military actor in protection of the communities that they are purportedly trying to support and protect. Training with local leaders, particularly traditional justice leaders that oftentimes are the focal points for mediating between rape survivors and families. Once they want to return to their homes, they have a traditional role in speaking with husbands, for example, and trying to convince them to receive the survivor again. A lot of advocacy is needed around the international community's role in what the international community can do and international donor communities can do to curb this phenomenon. Significant training in psychosocial counseling. What we found is that in our particular case, Catholic Relief Services, working through church organizations and church networks, we were in a very privileged position to be able to access communities that other organizations cannot. Congo in particular is a very Catholic country, and many organizations, international organizations, cannot reach certain areas due to insecurity. Yet the Catholic Church has been there throughout the course of insecurity, throughout the course of war. So what we'll do is work with those people that are at the front line and training them on how to attend to survivors of rape. Psychosocial counseling is something that we found critical because we found that oftentimes survivors were being told to exclusively rely on religion as a means to overcome their trauma and to read the Bible. While spirituality is incredibly important and we don't overrule that, there are also other professional ways to address trauma that we've been helping our partners to work on. We've constructed areas, safe spaces, where survivors can congregate and for it not to be so obvious to others in the community. Providing legal aid, we've facilitated that. Fistula repair, we've organized for doctors or specialists in fistula repair to go out to certain zones and train up other doctors in the bush, so to speak, so that, and also equip them so that they can perform these surgeries. Access is a very, very, very difficult problem in Eastern Congo. So getting as much health infrastructure out into these remote areas is important for survivors. And we've also developed an early warning system. I'm sure that you're all very familiar with Kony 2012, Invisible Children's video. They reference an early warning system in their video. Prior to Invisible Children working on that, we developed an early warning system with a bit of a different twist. They exclusively focus on communications equipment. But what we did is, I'm going to skip over this, I think it's too much detail. What we did is work with communities and their existing warning systems. The picture here is a village leader that uses a horn, blasts that horn to let his community know that there is some possibility of insecurity, perhaps, for example, a militia attack. But unfortunately, people cannot react quickly enough. Nor are everybody's insecurity concerns represented here. It is only what the village leader interprets or qualifies as an issue. So we helped communities organize themselves and actually had elections. And now refugees, displaced communities, the marginalized all have a voice in deciding what would warrant, in this case, the horn to be utilized. We've also improved communications beyond the horn, but I won't bore you with those details. Moving on to an example from Haiti, just to give you the context, something that was not covered very much in the news was what was happening on the border of Haiti after the earthquake. Thousands upon thousands of Haitians displaced towards the east of Haiti, right on the border with the Dominican Republic. There was already a pre-existing prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence. This area was already notorious for trafficking. From Europe to South America, contractors, if you will, or recruiters going out to this area looking for children. I spent 5 months there, and just to give you one example, while I was there, 11 children, Haitian children, turned up on the Dominican side of the border just 2 minutes away, dead. Their organs had been removed. So trafficking was already an issue, and then we have a huge influx of people after the earthquake. 12,000 IDPs, internally displaced persons, excuse me, and an absence of partners, an absence of NGOs to work on these issues. Everybody migrated exclusively to Port-au-Prince because of the epicenter of the earthquake. Yet we noticed that there was strong civil society there, a local community civil society. So what we did was we took a three-pronged approach. We developed direct services for trafficking survivors, and services to intercept children from being crossed over from Haiti into the Dominican Republic, and services for those children to be able to track their families from whom they had been separated. We also established a safe house to accommodate these women and children. And we worked intensively with local government authorities who, up until the time of this project, were oftentimes either knowingly or unknowingly collaborating with traffickers on the border, unfortunately. Part of that is simply a lack of support from the central government in Port-au-Prince on what their role is and providing the necessary equipment and capacity for them to carry out their job, as well as lending them a sense of pride for police and border authorities to assume their role as protectors in society. So through our direct services and referral network, We provided psychosocial care, case management. We accompanied rape survivors and children from the border for medical and legal assistance. We ensured confidentiality, which in the case of trafficking is very critical, particularly, and we provided shelter. The Safe House, we developed a system of criteria for people that can enter the Safe House, for how long, what would be the protocols to ensure traffickers roaming in the area would not know where these children were, given that they have, excuse me for framing it this way, but very high prices on their head. So it's critical. Safety and confidentiality of a safe house are central to any such operation. And worked on, as I mentioned, capacity building and sensitization with judges, police, border authorities, healthcare personnel. Just to give you an example of how important it is, central government support with healthcare personnel. Many women I found who were raped did not go to seek healthcare because they were being charged. When in reality, since the criminalization of rape in 2005, the government of Haiti developed policies amongst the various ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Health, to make healthcare for rape survivors completely free. But the directors of public hospitals aren't in the field, aren't aware of that. So part of the work that CRS and other NGOs do is just to bridge that knowledge, or unfortunately supplant the state in distributing that kind of knowledge and empowering them to assume the responsibility of providing free health care. And as a result, women started seeking health care. Too much detail. I think we could stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to hear a few thoughts from our two respondents, and they're going to sort of help us start thinking about terms, ideas, questions we might want to focus on in our smaller discussion group.
Okay. All right, good, sorry. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and thank you, Francisca, for your incredible presentation. I want to start with something that just struck me at the end. I have to say I didn't see the presentation beforehand, so this is completely impromptu comments. The point about how occasionally CRS and other NGOs working in partnership with you have to supplant the state because the state is not doing what we would expect a state to be doing. It strikes me as so much of what you said impresses me as amazing, incredibly important work. But that in particular, I think the ideal state, the nature of it, I'm a jurisprudence person, I do legal philosophy. So when I think about the nature of law and the nature of the just state, I think about the ability of the state to coordinate for the common good. And in these situations, either through natural disaster or conflict, where the state has completely lost that capacity, I think despite the amazing challenges you're facing, the success that you've had in coordinating for the common good to try to provide some of these basic support and infrastructures are really to be commended for the work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple things I want to just focus our mind on as well is when we hear these horrific stories of violence abroad, violence in a place that seems quite remote from our day-to-day experiences here on the main line of Philadelphia, it can be tempting to think of sexual and gender-based violence as a problem that happens over there, that happens in war-torn areas, that happens in places that have suffered horrible natural disasters, and where there's a total breakdown of law and order. And I take on board the point that breakdown in law and order certainly exacerbates and allows this to flourish in a way that it doesn't flourish here. But I think a lot of the underpinning dynamics and causal factors are still very present in American society, and the sort of the patriarchal attitudes toward women, the easy acceptance of things like domestic violence and sexual violence, even here on campuses, is something that we just need to be cognizant of to remind ourselves that sexual and gender-based violence is a problem that many of us experience in our daily lives, and our friends experience it, and it's right here on the ground as well. So I suppose I just want to encourage us to reflect not only on what we've heard about what's going on in distant locations, but also how patriarchy contributes to sexual and gender-based violence right here in our own backyard. And you mentioned the trafficking at the border of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the trading of sex for food by aid workers in refugee camps. And I think it might be interesting for us to reflect on some of the parallels between the sort of dynamics that happen when desperately poor or otherwise exploited or disempowered people just in Philadelphia or even on the main line of Philadelphia are being prostituted, and what effectively amounts to trafficking happening right here in our own backyard. And just one more point, and then I'll stop.
Okay.
When Francisca had taken us through some of the causal factors regarding sexual and gender-based violence, I think one of the things that struck me as maybe worth more reflection, or perhaps I just misunderstood it, was the dynamic of homes where women were now contributing to the upkeep of the house and providing for their family and for their children. And that was causing men to feel somewhat disempowered, and that was increasing interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, what I call domestic violence. And I suppose in my mind, the more that women can have access to resources, have access to power outside the home, have access to sources of empowerment outside the patriarchal structure, the more likely it is that down the road we'll be able to decrease sexual and gender-based violence. So I suppose I wanted to maybe encourage us to think about that dynamic and just wonder whether the women having now a more leadership role in the house is thought of really as a causal factor to domestic violence, or whether it's slightly more complicated than that. But again, I may have just misunderstood the comment I made. So I shall close there. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think the wording was musing. I don't know how you can muse about sexually based gender violence, but I'm just going to throw out stuff, not necessarily formed a thesis necessarily, but points at which I think might be useful for us to really consider it as Americans. So this is going to feel a little rapid fire, but I think that's the nature of what I've been asked to do. That's all I can do really at this point. With this, some of the things that stood out to me are the different ways in which sexual violence is used, and I think it's good to distinguish, and sometimes it's used as currency, sometimes it's used as power, sometimes it's used out of fear of avoiding the whole concept of honor, which I think are different levels in which we can think about sexual violence in different ways as having different sort of points in that. And by and large, I tend to think about things from the side of perpetrators rather than survivors. That's just the nature of what I do. So to try to understand what drives in men in this case to commit what drives men to commit sexual violence is a more dangerous question. It's a more puzzling question. It's a more frustrating question. But for me, it's the not more important than survivors, but at least as important to get in front of what causes perpetration to happen in the first place. So perhaps to think about the drive and the role that plays in that, and the role of fear, not only as fear used as to impose fear upon a population, in this case women, but also the way in which rape and sexual violence is used by commanders and leaders of armies, and how they marshal obedience within their own ranks, and using violence as a way to pacify and cow and their own people, and in this case, young men 18 to 24, into obedience. And I think that's also a way that sexual violence is used too, which is not a way of excusing the actions of men, but also a way of reframing that there's also another level at which this exists, and used within a culture which highly honors women and their role as life givers, probably more than we in America can really understand. Then the use of rape and sexual violence becomes even more poignant. How can you commit such atrocity against life givers? And so that actually comes into the effect not only on those who are violated, but also the violation that happens to the human being in that whole transaction of sexual violence. That there's damage on both sides, and that if we don't address that violence that's being done on both sides, I think we miss out on trying to understand why it happens in the first place. And understanding Africa and understanding the particular scope and scale of what's happening in places like DRC right now is really, really important. I wonder sometimes whether, and I respectfully disagree on this, is I don't know whether this is about us. I don't know whether we can draw a parallel between what happens in America and what is happening right now in DRC. The scale and the level of atrocity is so different. It's so much more. I wonder whether there's something else going on there that we need to take into account rather than just traditional gender roles and empowering women to get out of the home and work. I just don't see that as really working in places like DRC. But again, I bring that up as a question and a topic for debate. Let's see. The other idea that might come is how do we reframe violence? How do we disarm violence? How do we, and especially in the case of honor and power, how do we take away impunity? Not only from a law and order perspective, but also from a sense in which how do you reframe violence so that violence is not something that is seen as having any advantage? Right now in places like this, sexual violence has an advantage right now. And that, if we don't understand how that works as an advantage to those who perpetrate, then we might miss out on how we undermine that advantage to say that it's more of an advantage not to perpetrate, which in a way you can come at it two ways. You can replace that advantage with another advantage, or you can create a level of where you take away impunity, where you take away that fear and that intimidation that is at work at the level of these types of situations. And also, I think the bigger question, which is tough for us as Americans, is how do we help? I mean, we can talk about this in abstract thing, and I think referencing the Kony 2012 is really an important thing about what do we do in the face of these atrocities? How can we best help? And I think that's something that we all struggle with as Americans, that we want to do the right thing. We want to be on the side of goodness. We want to bring justice and equity to people. That's why we're here. And it's very, very frustrating to know how to do that. So I think being able to connect the dots that way and really talking about that, the role of education, the role of advocacy on this end, and what we can do, where we put our resources is also something that might be helpful to talk about in our groups. So.
Okay, great. Thanks to both of you, and thanks again to Francisca. Now we're going to break up into groups of about 8 is what I think we thought would be the ideal number. And we're going to split the room in half. So the half on my left, maybe you'll address
Close the doors.
The first question, which is what are the forces and factors that are shaping the situation? So that's this side of the room. And then the second question, what ultimately is needed to change the situation? And if you have enough time to switch talking about each question within your groups as well. So I guess we're hoping that people will be able to sort of form groups on their own and find a way to kind of coalesce. And you'll have about 15 minutes for the discussion, and maybe somebody from the group will emerge as a kind of spokesperson who can then come up and talk about sort of key ideas that were developed in your small groups discussion after about 15 minutes. You were having such interesting conversations. I'm sure there are people who could help us get a sense of what those conversations were about. It's really just great. Thank you.
Yeah, in our group, our discussion became largely about how us in America, how we can respond to these different issues. And we were kind of arguing about how similar and different the issue of sexual violence here and elsewhere is, and also how much of Western culture can inform or help these other cultures. What aspects or ideals do we hold that would be helpful to other people, or are things that we should be careful about because they don't apply everywhere? So, I mean, I don't know that we came to any like big conclusions. We're kind of in the middle of discussing it, but that was the main part of our discussion.
Great. So, Francisca, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to wait and hear other?
I think Sue wanted.
Okay. All right. So, other representatives from other groups want to step? Great. Oh, you have a microphone. Okay.
We were just speaking about the idea of American media and how that plays a role in how other, I guess, weaker nations see us and basically assume that we are the right nation, we're powerful, we're democratic. And I guess a question I would want to pose is, how much does that actually play out in the field? How much, I mean, in my personal experience, I've seen people who kind of believe a certain thing because the U.S. believes it. And I'm just wondering, specifically with music and how sometimes our music can be degrading to women, and if that almost makes it okay for men in other countries to speak to a woman a certain way, or to hit her, or treat her basically just like a sexual object, and basically just how American culture can play out in that role, if that is a major factor.
Okay.
I can't help being, I was saying Colombia is in my head. I'm horrified by the fact that there's no outcry, that those Secret Service agents and military were exploiting women. It's all about jeopardizing the president's safety, which I'm sure is important and significant. But in our own culture, we are so, well, they're just prostitutes. And if you know anything about that field, 70% of women who are prostituted have been abused sexually before they got into prostitution. So I'm trying to just hope that there'll be a little bit of sympathy for women who are prostituted and for those 20-some Colombian women that were forced, probably because of poverty, to be instruments of service, and there's no discussion about that aspect of that action. So a lot of our conversation was, some of our conversation was around that you know, how do we sensitize men? And I was happy to hear, we were happy to hear that you're doing some of that, CRS is doing some of that in the villages in Congo. So that was some of the gist of some of our conversation.
We were charged with trying to answer the second question, which is a bit problematic because it is so large of a question. But I think we could sum it in two broad areas, and those would be both external and internal factors. So in terms of internal factors, that would be the sort of changing the outlook of the societies that we're trying to help. So giving the education we need, trying to change their frame of mind so they realize that there is inherent value to all persons, things like that. And then with external affairs, that's trying to get countries who are not countries that are, I guess, at risk, involved and engaged in ways that are beyond just simple, here's $20 every now and then, but in ways that are sustained and constantly working for the long haul, rather than just, oh, well, I touched you something here, I thought that fixed it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi there. We talked about a few different things in our group back here. I really appreciate it when you're talking about sensitization, that as peace building I think is necessary, sort of before, during, and after violence. So we talked about that and building right relationship and community for peace building purposes. We also came back quite a few times to in trying to answer that second question. I don't know, I'm kind of struck with like what can we do as Westerners? And one of the things we have to do is check our Western ideas at the door and talk and be in dialogue and conversation with people where they are and appreciate the different cultures and histories of where they're coming from. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thanks. I guess we have one more.
Yeah, so we talked about the first question. We looked at it in two different ways. First would be whether it be that country's cultural traditions, or cultural gender traditions, where a lot of those countries have the woman being in charge of many household chores. So she'd be going out in the countryside or in the bush, alone to get water, firewood, or certain things like that. And when they're alone doing those kinds of things, they can be very vulnerable. They're alone, you don't know who's out there. Even if you walk it every day, there can be different people there at different times. Secondly, being the influence of Western ideology and culture on developing countries, where people see certain things from American media or pop culture where women should be educated, women need to have jobs, women should be pushing to be equal with men. And a lot of men can see that as a threat to their own power over women. And how does that relate to, can the woman become an equal to a man in a country or culture where that hasn't been acceptable for centuries, for however long period of time. So there is already a tradition of this is a woman's role, and now a lot of women try and climb the social ladder. How do those two interact with one another?
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, one more, great.
So what we talked about in our group, one of the things we highlighted was the second question was also the need to change the situation. And what we brought out was
The
that
what
not
situation?
only having
How
like
we
people
need to
from
change
from Western areas come over there and actually speak with them, but we related to the movie The Help, how you have the person that goes over and they're interested and they want to help, but at the same time, you coming in as a foreigner, they don't know you, you don't understand the culture that they live in because you're not a part of that culture. No matter how long you may have stayed there and visited, you're not a part and ingrained in that culture the way that they are. So finding a leader and a representative within that culture to stand up for it, and then allowing that to help it spread like wildfire, because you can say this is what's good, and obviously like they'll agree because they're not content with the situation, but that's the situation that they've been living in all their lives. So to find somebody that can really be the face of that movement and really get it going, I think it's definitely going to be like a key thing in inciting change, because you can come in and say, oh, I'm from the U.S. and this is what we think, and this would be really great, and you can tell as many women as you like, but you need one of those women to tell other women, and tell the ones that aren't even brave enough to stand up and come to a meeting where it's being discussed because they may be so oppressed. So just having somebody that can do that and can kind of be that factor, be that face that stands up for the movement.
Okay, great, thank you. So, you feel like you
God.
addressed at least some of the questions, or?
Oof, yeah, I'll try. I'm fascinated by the fact that there was essentially an East-West debate in this room. Oh, gosh. Well, I'll say that I think we have to be very, very careful in understanding what are the factors behind sexual violence in emergencies and humanitarian aid situations. And I do take issue generally, as many people do, with thinking that this may be cultural. It's not. And I think that in many of these countries, including Congo, the absolute value and respect that is placed on women is far beyond at times, respect and value of women in Western cultures. I'm talking specifically about rape. There are different roles of gender, notions of gender roles that I won't get into here. It's a very complex discussion. But I think that it's careful to understand that there is, I'm so sorry, I forgot, Dr.
Horner, Tim.
Horner's, that sexual violence is a currency. It's several things beyond just a demonstration of disrespect or undervaluing of women and girls. So there's a whole economy behind it. There are reasons for it to happen. In the case of Congo, unfortunately, it's very, very tied to the mining industry and to the gains that various different rebel groups can attain by securing areas that are rich in gold, diamonds, coltan, copper, tin. There are, I don't want to oversimplify this, but there are bad apples in every society. And the problem is when things break down after war, after an earthquake, after flooding, and traditional family structures break down, those bad apples seem to flourish more. And that's why it's so shocking. But just a thought on that. Someone said about can women be equal to men? I think a gentleman over here, an empowerment and at what point that can happen. I had a very, very interesting experience in refugee camps in eastern Chad. CRS, along with several other aid organizations, for the 8th of March, which is International Women's Day, organized lots of fanfare, festivals in the camps to try and just, alleviate the daily life in camps and also celebrate women. Just after, the day after, this was 2006, the day after, health centers reported an increase in the number of women that sought assistance. Domestic violence overnight had gone up. And why? Because we did not engage men. So we were only working with women, and men became suspicious and they felt disempowered. So there is a balance. That's to say, I think, that issues of empowerment, I think that really needs to be addressed before a crisis in development contexts and in our societies today, Western or non-Western, the global North or the global South, because it's setting the stage to assist when a crisis does happen, that we don't see these kinds of examples, that we don't see within a household that an individual would beat his partner because she's bringing home more money and maybe he feels disempowered. It's because the work wasn't done prior, so to speak. What else? I think, the Colombia example, Cartagena. The Secret Service. I am still to this day, I'm overwhelmed how that has not been discussed in the media. It's all about compromising the president's security. And this comes on the heels of reports of just how many women in our armed forces are raped, to the degree that now I believe a special unit has been erected within the US Army. So I highlight that to say, I genuinely don't know. I haven't had the experience that something that is said through an American movie or through an American song is taken on as, well, that is it. I actually have a bit of the contrary experience, that typically, oh, that's coming from America, it must be a lie. They always have a reason, a motive behind that, even humanitarian aid. There's a reason, there's a motive behind it. But what I do think, we have to play a role. We have to provide an example, and we're not providing the right example. And it's very hard. It's very, very difficult to be somewhere, and this is a true story, and hear, well, at the end of the day, you guys, you let this I don't remember her name, this Guinean woman that was a housekeeper in a hotel in New York. Yeah, well, I don't remember her name, but Diallo. You just let the whole affair whittle away and DSK go. And I heard that from a Congolese man in a village who was just listening to RFI, Radio France International, every day and drew his own conclusions. So we need to establish examples, and we're not establishing an example with our Secret Service guys in Colombia. And that is exploitation, and they are likely underage, and hence that is legally rape, period. What else? How can we respond to these issues in America? Well, do I still have a minute or two?
Yeah. I think
okay.
that's like 5 or 7
minutes. Apart from establishing an example, I think that there are clear-cut examples of how the United States government and other donor agencies have engaged thanks to the American public or youth movements across the world. Congo has been something that we could have seen more engagement and more improvements in U.S. policy towards the Congolese government and towards demanding the cessation of impunity of rapists. But I also think that we see quite a bit of aid money go towards trying to reform the security sector in Congo and trying to hold the government accountable for what's happening in the East, thanks to movements. Whether it's these youth days on Capitol Hill where students go and speak to their senators about what is happening in Congo, whether it's a video such as Kony 2012, and to be perfectly honest, for reasons that I won't go into here, I'm not very happy with the video. But wow, the response was quite amazing. It can be debated whether the government's response is appropriate in terms of their military actions in the Great Lakes right now in response to the Kony 2012 video, but it shows that youth can pressure the government to do things. So I don't have a perfect response, but I do think that sustained engagement, discussing it on university campuses and going to DC or speaking to your policy makers about these issues does help, and I feel that I've seen that on the ground.
Can I throw just in the wake of that one of the ways, just in the wake that the Dodd-Frank bill that just came out, one of the things that's in there is that companies now have to account for where they get their minerals. In particular, phone companies now have to be explicit that they get where they get them, and especially with DRC, with Congo, that if they get there, they have to make sure that they have to be explicit about where they get it. So that gives actually you guys a tremendous amount of power, not just advocacy, but you've got the power in your pocket right now. Because if there is a student movement that says that we will not buy phones that have conflict minerals in them, and Motorola, and Nokia, and Samsung, and Apple start having to make accountability, which they now legally have to do, and you can get this information on the web now, man oh man, that will start shining a light on this area in ways that have not been shined on before, and it's a direct route to the pockets of the people who buy the minerals in DRC, and would undermine that whole thing in a very dramatic way. And I don't know whether you guys are up to this challenge about buying the phone you don't want. Honestly, that's like a huge thing, but if you want to get them where it hurts, then you say, I'm not buying that phone, and I won't have conflict in my pocket.
I feel like there's a university that did just make that commitment somewhere in the States. I could be wrong, but...
That'd be ours. But no, but that's a real connect, that's a direct one. And I can't start that movement. I can't do that. Only you guys can do that.
But that would also be the free market, and, people crying for the
I know, but I'm talking about
free market.
student power. Where students have power, where young people.
But that's what I mean, though, still, but they would be operating on the basis of, quote, the free market.
Right.
I do want to say that Dodd-Frank largely passed because of advocacy and pressure on the government. It was just a nationwide movement, so that's wonderful. I should also add, I don't want to simplify it either and say it's exclusively about conflict minerals, because it's not. It's a very complex environment. But that is the lifeline. I mean, that's where perpetrators, be it government or illegally armed groups, that's where they get their money from. Thank you.
So we're out of time. I think it's been a really productive conversation. I want to thank Francisca again, and also Tim Horner and Michelle Dempsey. If we could just give everybody another round.